Most people don't realize that about 40,000 humans die on US roadways, either inside the car or outside the car on an annual basis. And that number's been pretty consistent for many, many years, decades even. And we now have vehicles that are more technologically advanced than we've ever had before. Radar systems and airbags and automatic emergency braking. And also the structural aspects of the car are so much safer. Lane keeping assist, backup cameras. Think about all the new stuff that's keeping us safer while we drive. If that's the case, why are we still losing 40,000 people a year? And this is probably the more important question. Why is that not at scandal level? We're talking about the equivalent of somebody blowing up a professional sports stadium on a yearly basis. That would be horrendous, and it would be nightly news. And yet, we just absorbed that number in the US, and the number worldwide is even more dramatic. So I'm joined by Vinn White and Jane Lappin to discuss some of the insights into this. And this is not just another safety webinar. We're reframing how we look at fatalities, each with a ripple effect of grief and impact. I'm currently working on a book titled 40,000 is a Real Number. Some of what we'll be discussing today will be going into that book. And it asks, why do we quietly accept 40,000 deaths, most of which could be preventable on a year without doing much about it? So today we're going to explore why current tech hasn't delivered proportional safety gains, what role speeding, impairment, distraction, and vehicle size plays, how incentivizing consumers and other parties into the ecosystem can shape safer outcomes, and what real accountability might look like for everyone in this ecosystem, including manufacturers, drivers, regulators, and insurers alike. This session builds on prior work for prior webinars, and that was about the legal and regulatory systems. Now we're zooming out a bit, because when we really get to brass tacks, when we're talking about people who are dying, what could be more important when we start to think about how to create a risk management system? I'll start off with you, Vinn. Can you just tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I'm glad to be here with you and Jane. My background is a bit diverse. I've kind of sat at the intersection of transportation, safety, and innovation for a while now. I advised the governor of New Jersey during the onset of the pandemic. I've led a safety agency, been a part of a great team under Secretary Buttigieg, served as the first chief AI officer at USDOT. And so, bringing from a safety operational perspective, bringing research together with enforcement, the stakeholder community to push that mission of safety. Safety's FMCSA, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, it is our middle name. And so bringing all those tools to bear, I've been very fortunate to work with or for U.S. transportation secretaries. And bear with me as I kind of take us down memory lane here and give credit where it's due. Rodney Slater, Secretary of DOT, he put safety at center stage. He shifted, a more proactive stance for compliance and gave kind of the early seeds of safety principles across all of the modes. Secretary Ray LaHood, who I joined in 2008, 2009, his tenure was very much known by prominently placing distraction, right? This is an emerging national concern. And so overhauling the 5-star crash rating system, pushing automakers to advance safety technologies, things like lane departure warnings and electronic stability control, Those were his centerpieces. Anthony Fox was a little bit different in terms of focusing on autonomous vehicles and vehicle to vehicle communication. We had a rule on V2V, emphasizing safety is not a novelty, but it needs to guide deployment. It needs to be a part of the holistic emerging technology suite. And then finally, working under Pete Buttigieg, we've now entered the age of artificial intelligence. So leveraging a safe system approach, it doesn't just look at car and driver, brings these other elements, the domain, the environment, post-crash care, road design into the picture. And so investing in smart infrastructure and embedding equity and automation into the future of mobility. So I know it's a mouthful, but when I was at FMCSA, investing tens of millions of dollars into safety technology, enforcing rules to reduce crashes, responding to crises like the collapse of the bridge in Baltimore. I oversaw the transformation of a stovepiped legacy IT system at the same time. And then certainly serving as the chief AI officer helped lay the foundation for putting things like ethical, secure, and emission-driven AI policy in place across the 55,000 member department. But despite all of those credentials, I would say being the oldest of 6 kids, being the father of 2 young kids, that's really what motivates me. And so safety isn't just my profession, but it's a personal passion of mine.
Well,
Thank you. I am never going to follow him ever again.
our moderator, Jane.
Nice to be here with you both. I never want to follow Vinn. I have nothing to say about myself that possibly measures up to what he's just brought us into this discussion. I'm previously the Global Director for Regulatory and Policy for the Toyota Research Institute on behalf of the robots and the automated vehicles. Before that, I was at the US DOT Volpe Center doing research at the intersection of human behavior and technology, but with a particular focus on how the advanced technology influences how we consume transportation, less how we behave in the tech. And in this life here, I am the moderator and research nerd, data nerd, to Mike's mobility nerd and Vinn's policy wonk. And we've agreed in advance that I can cut them off if they're going over time, because we've got really important topics to cover in this discussion, beginning with data points. And Mike mentioned them in his introduction. When the NHTSA data collection began, I think it was in the middle 70s, traffic deaths were somewhere around 50,000. Here we are, better than 50 years later, and we're up above 40,000. Granted, that's as a ratio, the downward trend is a little more steep, but not a lot steeper. And we're looking at a lot of deaths. Now, Mike said, I don't just want to look at these as numbers and trends. I want to keep in mind that these are people and lives, families. But the useful way of thinking about the trends is, what have we been doing over the course of these decades to influence the deaths? Well, we've made seatbelts a requirement front and back. Lots of states have seatbelt laws as primary laws, which means the cops can pull you over if they see you're not wearing a seatbelt and ticket you. So that's significant. Our speed limits are more moderate now than they were in the 70s. We've got, as Vince mentioned, stability control, automated. I'm sorry for that. The vehicle systems, passive and active, have more safety features. So what kind of an impact are we having on drivers? what are the big issues that remain? You want to start with that, Mike? What are the big issues?
Well, I think some of the big issues is that the conversation is probably not woven together enough by all the participants in the ecosystem. In fact, I don't even think the participants in the ecosystem understand that they're in an ecosystem. And so what I mean by that is insurers obviously care an awful lot about car accidents. And there's not a lot of dialogue by the folks that make those cars. And then you start to add in different regulatory schemes. The insurance companies are regulated by state insurance commissioners, and automakers and transportation in general is regulated for the most part at a federal level with snippets of some local laws. I believe that is some of the problem of not getting to real solutions that get to some of those potential solutions that once we start to talk about them, I think people will see the stakeholders having a play here.
And what about the stakeholders or the drivers, where we can see that crashes, the crashes on record, the deaths on record show excessive speed, driver impairment, and distracted driving as being the primary contributors in fatal and injury crashes. Then your experience with federal motor carrier, it's all about the driver, isn't it? Driver training, I think sobriety testing, drug testing. Does any of that generalize to the broader population, or is it a special group with federal motor carrier?
So Jane, I think what I want to do is, first, there's a point on just the notion that the proportional gain from 50 years ago to today, right? All these advancements that we've had, there are a few sort of controlling factors. I would say rather than the technology hasn't delivered, I would say it hasn't kept pace with the habits and the behaviors and the risks developing on our roads. Variables like the modern device with apps constantly fighting for our attention, regardless of the domain, sometimes knowing you're in a vehicle, most times not really making that distinction. It sort of underscores Mike's point about some of the actors developing in this space, not knowing that they're part of a certain ecosystem and that there are these risks. So certainly, the pandemic period opened up roads in a way that we hadn't seen in the 50 years prior. And so, speed becoming more prevalent over that period. And then just the manufacture of these vehicles, I can barely remember, given my age, coming off the back end of when, Toyotas and Hondas kind of started this trend of making vehicles much smaller. And now we're in an age where kind of a bigger is better. So the size, the weight, just the visibility of these vehicles, right? So I just want to acknowledge up front that the context has shifted and changed and different things have emerged that have shaped behaviors. I think what you're talking about, and it relates to both, on the trucking side, but also light duty and let's just say all drivers in general, is kind of cultural. Once again, in my own experience, I didn't have a choice necessarily to get in a vehicle that did or didn't have a seatbelt. They were just required at a certain point, whereas my parents sat on bucket seats and, in a 55 Chevy, which might as well be trampoline, not having those certain safeguards. So I think there's also kind of this examination of human behavior. Those things that you called out, though, those are highly preventable, right? Seatbelt use, you can use them or not use them. And I know you're going to get to the data here that tells us, those big numbers that slice up the pie of 40,000 and which part is seatbelts and which part is, impairment, right? Driving under the influence. And now the next emerging slice that's preventable is distraction. So I think those things carry over. In the trucking realm, we brought every tool to bear to not just remind truckers, right, of the risks and train truckers, but the companies that they may be a part of. And those companies have now turned a corner, I believe, when it comes to the technology piece. Monitoring their truckers, finding different ways to do it, incentivizing truckers, right, for better behavior, for better safety records.
And is there an analogy? Is there learning to be had, recognizing that the truck company owners and the truckers, the independent operators, have a vested interest in improving safety outcomes, reducing crashes? Is there learning that we can leverage from that fleet and high liability arena to influence regular drivers?
Yeah,
Me with my car, you with yours.
I think the answer to that is yes. And you're starting to see it, the onboard monitoring of driver behavior, the ability to understand that the driver may be experiencing fatigue well before they admit that they are tired. These are things that, with the power of artificial intelligence, data consumption, you can connect both observing the driver and alerting the driver to what's happening. And you can do it in a way that's not penalizing the driver. And so I think what you're starting to see are these bigger fleet companies, your Amazons, your DHLs, relying on this. But the trick is really to get the driver to understand that this is in the best interest of everybody, right? And first and foremost, the driver yourself, right? Who you're with on the road. Is
Well,
the goods going to reach their destination, right? So there's a kind of a win-win for everybody. And I
Well,
think
and you
terrible.
brought up, I'm cutting in. You brought up a really important point earlier when you're talking to individuals, to private citizens, and you want to motivate change. Their vested interests may not be what they've invested in their car. It may not be what they're paying for insurance, although I think we need to come back to that. It may be their vested interest in their children and their younger siblings. That may be where where we can build greater leverage in the driving population. But Mike, switching back to one of your observations, how do we bring the newer players to the table, the companies whose products are creating the distractions? That was a point that that you hit strong when we were talking earlier about this session. How do we bring those newer devices and the device manufacturers into the conversation about improving traffic safety?
Yeah, I think just to give you some framework as to distracted driving, for instance, it's not as high as some of the other numbers for these fatalities. I'll just go through these quickly. So alcohol impaired, about 10,000 of the 40,000. Speeding, 8,300. Total unrestrained, 11,000. But distracted driving is about 3,500 deaths a year. Now, listen, I'm sure the research on this is a bit soft. I've seen a lot of police reports that say, was the driver belted, for instance, or using a cell phone, and boxes are checked no. And I know that's not accurate because they've asked the driver, or they don't see any evidence of it. But the distracted driving piece, and let's just take that for a moment. Let's save 3,500 people a year by eliminating distracted driving. So it does involve all the cultural things we've been talking about, but there are technological fixes for this. They may not be here and available today, but we're just 3 steps away from doing it. So this phone sits on my dash. I happen to drive a Tesla and a Rivian. Both those cars know when I pick the phone up. They know it because they can see into the cabin with the passenger cabin observation camera. And the car also knows where this phone is at all time because it's connected to it in many ways. So just even moving it, some car manufacturers are able to discern the phone is no longer in the exact same spot. So now we get into the cultural parts of this. Do we want to give up our freedom? Do we want to be the people that say, I never touch my phone. I don't text ever. Even if I'm using the phone for orientation, I'm trying to find out where I'm going in a rental car. So could we develop a system where passengers agree, or I'm sorry, drivers and passengers agree, or primarily drivers, and car manufacturers have a technology made available to both those drivers and insurers provide a discount based on either as you go performance or the number of times you do this, or could we get to something like an interlock device where that phone will not allow texting while the phone is in motion? All those things are possible technologically. We can incentivize the public to use it if the insurance companies can develop processes to incorporate those habits into real financial incentives. And then there's also this incentive I'm envisioning where car manufacturers have a suite that does this, and the customer makes that suite by purchase or by option on the car. And then insurers recognize that and provide a discount and then promote the fact that this suite in one manufacturer's platform or many, use OnStar, for instance, that's the General Motors platform. And so something like that, and you say, you have an OnStar car, we'll give you a discount.
Yeah, and I'm aware of products that if they're not on the market yet, they're certainly in pilot use. There's a Wing Driver product. It's an app on the phone that a friend of mine is helping to develop using AI to watch the driver's eyes, and through repeated training over time, the app is able to tell not just when the driver is looking at the road, but when the driver is actually engaged in the driving task, right? And so that would seem to be the kind of product that you're pointing to. Vin, I'm wondering what your experience was like at the department, bringing people to the table who the department may not have reached out to before as part of its exploration for improving safety. I know that Secretary Buttigieg did reach out on a number of occasions. What do you see as an opportunity to do that effectively in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so Secretary Buttigieg uplifted a safe system approach, sort of a policy for to improve safety across 5 specific areas. As said before, we used to look at it as car and driver, and now it's the environment, it's the road design, it's sort of what happens after the incident. And so you've got a range of areas, including vehicle technology, that can be improved. And we put it out. It wasn't a mandate from Congress. It was sort of soft power, the bully pulpit. It was not even our idea. I think it was the National Safety Council actually that helped stand this up over time. And we just sort of said, what a great idea. Let's adopt this and put it out there. We had a call to action. I want to say there were 150 companies and organizations that signed up and signed on to this. I mean, that's kind of how you have to do it in the universe where you don't have the mandates and you don't have the direction from Congress to do certain things. Building off of what Mike talked about, I think, having a suite of different, software, if you want to call it hardware, but in-vehicle equipment that together can increase safety. Where I would focus that suite and I'll come back to it, is, I have a 6-year-old who will probably be getting his permit in 10 years. And so you ask me, 5 years down the road when I'm ready to buy my next vehicle, if it has a suite, and call it whatever you want, but if it has a suite that can manage the phone piece, that can do the speed limiter piece, right? Right. The car can be governed by a certain speed, doesn't go over a certain speed, has all of the safety, right? AEB and lane departure and airbags, got the whole thing, right? And can also give a readout to the parent on the behavior, right? How many lane departures have happened while the kid took the car out? How many hard braking, right? These are things that can actually be received from vehicles these days. And so as a parent, if you ask me, am I willing to pay a subscription that goes with the enabling a vehicle? Like that's an investment I make every single day, right? And it becomes the old, you don't get the keys on Saturday night, right? The way that we can slice and dice data these days too, right? It could probably tell me how they behaved driving in the middle of the day versus as the day wore on, less visibility at night, right? So like as a parent, I get to say, like, look, you earned the ability to have the keys, right? I trust you. Because the data against all of this, right, between the ages of 16 and 19, fatalities 3 times as high, right?
Among teen drivers.
Among teen
Exactly.
drivers.
Exactly.
The next one for me is male drivers within that cohort
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
3 times the 3 times.
No, I have a son.
Right?
Absolutely
I have
was
2
my
boys.
worry. Yeah.
Exactly. I have 2 boys, and now I'm sitting here looking at this data going, okay. And then on top of that, new drivers, 16 years old, or if they have other young kids in the car, right? The data doesn't lie. It basically
That's
says
right.
they can jump by multiples of 1 and 2 and 3 times.
That's
So
right.
why would I ever take that chance? I think, Mike, you're hitting
And
it on the head. This can be made available.
so the next step would be for somebody to actually begin creating those packages and making them available right on the market. It's a market challenge. Is there going to be sufficient demand? Is the profit margin sufficient to motivate the company forward? Mike, with your experience in the insurance world, do you see that's a good opportunity? Or do you think that the public sector would need to incentivize with some kind of regulatory threat?
I don't, I don't see the insurers doing this alone, but I see the insurers being an important cog in this wheel. And fundamentally, I think we have to go back to the consumers first, because they are going to have to empower society to do this. So some of what we talked about as we were warming up for this session was, okay, you have certain liberties. You can drive without your seatbelt. It's against the law in many states. You can drive inebriated. Do you want someone to have data on those activities? More importantly, do you want to be held accountable for taking on more risk? Or do you want to be told no? Do you want, where are we going to go as a society? But listen, put aside the fact that somebody's child, somebody's parent, the pedestrian who lives across the street could be one of those 40,000. You could be one of those 40,000 too. And I think we need to bear in mind that the liberty piece of this probably needs to be revisited so we can develop a framework that makes the world safer for everybody.
So what you raise in terms of, personal autonomy, I would say when it comes to seatbelts, and particularly when it comes to drunk driving, we really don't have that freedom. There's a law against drinking and driving. And if we had, and there are laws against speeding, we have a speed limit, it's a law. Where those two behaviors so clearly link to death on the highway, wouldn't greater enforcement have an impact? And that's a leading question because I know the answer. Greater enforcement has an impact. Where we've seen, for example, automated speed enforcement, and my favorite example is France, where the premier of France in, I think it was 2002, Chirac, said it's completely unacceptable for France to have one of the highest roadway death rates in Western Europe. We're going to begin greater enforcement. We're going to use cameras and have automated speed enforcement. And over the next 5 years, they dropped their highway death rates by 40%. There was nothing else to attribute it. It was enforcement. Another example from New York City with speed governors. They've begun installing speed governors across the city fleet with measurable reductions in driving over the speed limit, sudden stops, and crashes. We know these technologies work. Where do they fit in your safety vision in combination with a market package? How do we move forward with a culture of safety in this country?
Well, first, I think we have to make the 40,000 a real number as opposed to a statistic. And we have to drive this point home that we're losing way too much love and relationship and potential. And not to mention the fact, we're not talking about injuries. We're just talking about deaths. But think about how much of a financial impact that has on our society. So you can drive drunk. So why aren't cars like a speed governor equipped with some sort of interlock device that stops the car from functioning unless you're sober? And we can't be that far away from that technology. We know it exists. So why is that not in a car? That's 10,000 of these 40,000 deaths, especially when you start talking about Vinn's younger adolescent drivers who aren't going to use the best judgment all the time. God knows we all didn't. But we're now talking about not just waking up. We're talking about there is a technological component to this that can be a dramatic impact on all these attributes.
I'm looking at the questions. I know we're not at the end of, we haven't come to the Q&A portion, but there are some salient questions as we're speaking. For example, John Pedrick asked whether data regarding deaths allows identification of whether the vehicle had any of the new safety technology, feedback about hands on the wheel, lane guidance, for example, and whether there's evidence that there are fewer deaths for the vehicles with the safety technology. There are two answers to that question, John. One is that the profile of the vehicle, the safety equipment that's installed on the vehicle, is linked to the VIN number and not collected by the police at the scene of the accident. So there isn't easy and immediate correlation between what was going on in the vehicle's operating system at the time of the crash. And that's something else that Mike has had experience with. I know Vinn also has insight there. Is there evidence that there are fewer deaths for vehicles with the latest safety technology? I'm not sure how to answer that question, and I'm a little embarrassed to be caught without. Vinn, Mike, do you have input to that?
Well, bear in mind that Mr. Pedrick's one of the world's finest actuaries. He's going to want data. Yeah, I think there is, but very limited. And part of the reason is we don't have enough data transparency. So the vehicles we're operating on now, the 2025 fleet, 100% of them have embedded modems. They can transmit as much data as the car can assemble. It may not be some of the stuff on alcohol. It could be if we had an interlock device. Certainly seatbelts. Certainly distracted driving. We've already talked about the car can sense the phone. So we just haven't put those devices, we haven't put that data to use yet. And that's where the gap is, as far as I'm concerned.
I'll just add, I think that's
Yeah.
right. And I would only add that, we're in an age of data where it's not just understanding, right, the weather conditions, the road conditions, right, that can be a contributing causal factor. The vehicles themselves are emitting so much data at this point in time. I think the challenge has always been, right, over the last, I'd say 30-ish years or so, which type of data, how much of it, there's volumes, you can select this, but really this is going to give you the insight over here. And now in this age where we can leverage artificial intelligence, I think the most recent bipartisan infrastructure law provided historic investment in the data piece to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to overhaul, to modernize their fatality analysis reporting system database, basically where all this information goes from that local jurisdictional stuff. But now you have the vehicle piece as well. So how do you take all process, the causal factors? But now that you can leverage this, you're talking about a real moonshot moment here, where if it's done the right way and everybody can get their piece, right? If it's for profit, if it's advocacy, if it's the federal government, if we can get everybody rowing in the same direction, you have a real opportunity to really understand things like age, geography, right? The vehicle, the conditions externally, and so on and so forth.
Vince, one of our questions on screen from Sean Bennett is asking where you see the data that you were citing earlier. He writes much of the data you're referring to isn't available. Much of the data is only available using a CDR tool to retrieve EDR data. How would you respond to Sean Bennett's question?
I think I would take, right, what Mike is describing as the ecosystem or the ecosphere of all of those who are able to provide that information. So you've got an OEM community, you've got the driver, right? You have the public sector piece. And so you need to have the right sort of terms and handshake. I don't think you can do this from a regulatory perspective. I think what you need is more of that coalition of willing, right? Device manufacturers, whether it's, whoever owns the information on the EDR, right? You have to have the right handshake to unlock all of this information. And it sounds like, wow, what a job that has to be. But, if you're going to do this using rules and rulemaking and that process, that process is always going to be playing catch up to keep pace with
Jane,
the technological.
If I could just address the last question, and you're the moderator, so if you say no, I get it. But the EDR device is not the device that you go to for this data. That EDR device was created to judge airbag performance and what drivers are doing with stability control and seat belts. That device is so antiquated, and I say that with all due respect. I am on the Society of Automotive Engineer committee on EDR devices. It is an antiquated, hardly does the job, and you have to go get it. The data I'm talking about is massively being streamed from the car to the clouds. It's in the hands of OEMs. We have to get that level of data. Now, there's an interesting twist going on here. Some of the OEMs have the capability of beaming that data. They're beaming up information data and infotainment data, but they're choosing not to push up some of the safety related data because they don't want to have it in their hands. At the same point, some car manufacturers are, and then we get into this discussion about shouldn't consumers be entitled to their own data? So I think data transparency is critically important. Many government agencies or organizations like the NTSB have made those observations as well. We need that level of data, not EDR data, to inform some of these issues.
I was looking at the questions while I was listening to you and distracted by a really interesting sequence of questions that look at the economics of car ownership and maintenance and the cost benefit balance between what do these additional so-called safety technologies, the argument being they're not all linked to improved roadway or occupant safety, but they do all increase not just the cost of ownership, but also the cost of maintenance. One of our questioners cites Hildy, the Highway Loss Data Institute, as publishing findings that seem to suggest that the cost benefit doesn't work well enough. That when you add in the cost of maintenance of these systems, that maybe you don't get enough return, safety return on the investment. And to balance our political discussions and your references to Secretary Buttigieg, in this current administration, they're putting a lot of focus on how, if we keep pricing these new and tech-laden vehicles higher, we're going to take them further out of reach of normal middle income and low income Americans. The fleet will turn over more slowly and will actually have fewer tech tech safety packages on the road in relation to the increasing numbers of miles driven. So it's an interesting, how do we improve safety for people, lower income people? How do we measure the cost benefit impact of these at purchase and with maintenance over time? And so coming back to the observation about market solutions, help to make sense out of this. What's your take?
Well, I think my reaction to that, Jane, is somewhere in time, there was a vehicle way in the past that did not have a collapsible steering column. It did not have seatbelts. It did not have airbags. It didn't have crumple zone. I can go on and on and on about all these things that are now, I would even say, more than ubiquitous, right? It's not just mandatory. Would you get in a car? Would you get in a vehicle like that? People did at one point in time. Now, if you to say, okay, for all these things, we're going to pencil it out, and this is what it's going to cost. My point being, right, over time, certain technology becomes ubiquitous because it is proven. And I think the poster child for that is automatic emergency braking, where it was this coalition of willing automakers, right? This is a technology that started off as a feature in a luxury automobile, right, in the late, say, 90s, and has come such a ways that now all automakers, they're not going to design a vehicle. And 29, they're not allowed to manufacture a vehicle without AEB. So it's a long spectrum. And so if what we're going to do right now is say, well, this is going to cost a lot. I mean, I just look at the tale of history showing us that, like, if it was too much to have seatbelts, right? Or if it was too much to have airbags in vehicles, in luxury vehicles at a certain time, like here we are today, and many of us don't want to get in a vehicle without some of these features. So I get it. When you take just like the automated vehicle, right, that's being tested out, take your Waymo and what the cost is for radar, LiDAR, sensors, all of these things. Yeah, sure, it is very expensive. And maintenance, right, if you are in an accident where the sensors are damaged, like, sure, that's not the same cost as replacing a bumper circa 1985, right? I mean, all these things shift, and what really matters is the life-saving value of these things and the proven life-saving value of these things. For better or worse, the government needs to do the math and arrive at the numbers to understand and justify the cost of making something mandatory. Our hope is, like AEB, by that point in time, a coalition of willing will have already done these things.
So Jane, I want to speak to the Hildy study because that Hildy study does say something like that, but it certainly doesn't factor in 40,000 lives. It certainly doesn't factor in significant impairment. It doesn't factor in loss of income. What those studies are doing is saying, listen, if you have some of these safety/convenience, and frankly, I don't buy that distinction all that much, but okay. If you lump all that together, and yeah, those systems cost money when you put them in a car, and the insurance industry doesn't pay as much as a result of an accident. What is the value of the 40,000 lives? I mean, again, it's a tragedy. And are we really going to say, well, the cost-benefit analysis doesn't justify saving 40,000 lives? I don't think anybody's callous enough to say that. So I think that's a snippet of data or information that we need to bring to the table. But we have to get back to the reality. This technology will save lives. And I got to imagine, Vinn, you must have heard this many, many years when you were a regulator. Oh, if we put intrusion bars in the doors, that's going to drive up the cost of production. If we make windshields so that a human head can't go through it, that's now a regulated manufacturing standard. You can't, the windshield can't be penetrated. Hoods have to have crumple zones so they don't decapitate drivers. All of these things probably met with some resistance at one point.
Yeah, and we find ourselves, I want to bring this back around to NHTSA for a moment. We find ourselves with vehicles on the road, very large trucks. Yeah, what are they called? The pickup trucks, and very large SUVs with grills that are much more deadly than the slope of a passenger sedan. And so one of the things I wonder about, I see these and I think, where is NHTSA? How did this get by them? And I have to remind myself that NHTSA's authority is limited to the demonstrated dangers, objective data that clearly establishes the cause and effect, that they can't get ahead of these vehicle designs. I come back to our discussion about changing the culture to a culture of safety, that would enable a regulatory agency to get ahead of the risk, and publish guidance about the design of vehicles that are intended to preserve life in the event of a crash with a vulnerable road user. What we haven't said about the 40,000 deaths, the over 40,000 deaths, is that a significant proportion of them are not people within the vehicle, because there are airbags, there are seat belts, there are crumple zones, but innocent bystanders, people who are walking, bicycling on motorcycles or motorized bicycles, who are killed by cars. I wonder how we can begin to address that significant risk segment.
Well, I'll just chime in and say, I think, this isn't, just NHTSA or just the government, right? There are a lot of thought leaders and actors that are participating in these kinds of exercises that you're talking about, Jane. To call out one, the Society of Automotive Engineers International. They're not governmental, but they are a force. And thanks to Mike for participating on the various subcommittees, because they and others have stepped into a space to at least start to provide the insights, the analysis. And I'll give you a really good example, I think, that relates to us here is more recently, having put out an analysis on forward blind zone changes of popular vehicles over a almost 25-year period. It's out, right? What does this mean? What they did was they studied and measured blind zones in 6 top-selling light-duty vehicles. So they had a pickup truck, they had a few SUVs, they had some passenger cars, and they just looked at the different designs. And what they started to understand that we do not, right, as users, fully appreciate is that vehicles have changed with the advent of SUVs in such a way that it is creating less visibility for the driver to understand their surroundings. So, efforts like this are going to be meaningful analysis that help shine a light on what's happening all around us. And so hats off to SAE and others, universities, other countries that are taking a really strong look at this.
I want to go back to the questioners and acknowledge Sean Bennett, Cormac McKay, and Ellen Partridge, thanking them for a really lively dialogue in the question in the chat question area. I want to, though, ask you, because we've got 8 minutes left, where you want to close this discussion. What message do you want the listeners to walk away from this with? We've talked about the importance of behavioral changes in bringing down the death rates. We've talked about the importance of vehicle design, some of which is regulated, some of which that looks to me to be terribly dangerous and is not. We've talked about insurance companies and their role in influencing without regulatory change, but using liability and other financial leverage to affect safety. And we've talked about, and I think this is interesting, the core segment of safety consumers in this country are people with children. They are the most alert to safety advances, safety equipment, and of course, monitoring driver behavior. There's something in there. Where do you want to take this? And yeah, where do you want to take this? How would you summarize and suggest some next steps? Mike, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this short because I think there's room for a lot of people to have a lot of different opinions on this. But I'll just say this. We have to rethink this concept of the liberties we have. And we have to do more in the way of, creating rules, and that may infringe on some liberties. But just assume, I'll get to one point that illustrates this. The speed limit may be 70, but you shouldn't be at liberty to drive from 0 to 70 as quick as possible. That acceleration is right now not regulated by law. The 70 miles an hour is. But should you be allowed to drive that fast? And so I think we need to get to more of a mindset of you're not driving this car alone, you're driving it for everybody.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And what you've just raised is another data point to highlight that with increasing numbers of electric vehicles on the road, the potential of a very quick acceleration, 0 to 70, more cars can do it. More cars can leave that stop sign, accelerating into a turn, potentially into a pedestrian much more quickly and with much greater weight. So the physics are really against the pedestrians and the vulnerable road users. And
My
yeah,
rating, Jane, is 8,500 pounds. That's
for
three,
wow.
three times the size of the average motor vehicle, excluding trucks.
Yeah, and I'm thinking in my head about the Volkswagen Bug that I drove as a kid compared to that vehicle. I wouldn't stand a chance. Some of us think that the future highway heaven is when all of the vehicles have been debulked, and none of us are at risk to quite the same degree because we've got less bulk around us. Um, Vin, where do you want to go with this as a
Yeah,
closing observations and
I'm
going
glad, Mike, you
forward?
covered the sort of regulatory rulemaking piece. I think there's four sort of floating reactions I have. One is on leadership, and that is, now's not a time to not show leadership around this issue. I say this without any sort of, there's no partisanship here. There are not, when you look at the data, when you look at the fatality information, it's not red and blue. It's not looking at it like that. And so, part of me wishes, right, almost daily that any president or our president would tweet about this, right? Because it would all of a sudden have so much focus and attention. So we can't let up the gas on leadership, and I applaud the champions of this cause. Two, we talked about is culture. And, I'm a believer that you got to get them while they're young. And I think that if you were to develop sort of that suite and that approach, right, where kids who turn into adults just, it's automatic that I put on my seatbelt. And it's sad that there are still a number of non-compliant seatbelt, non-users in the world. But I think that goes a long way. And I think that beat that out there for the public to consume and understand is really important to get kids while they're young. Coalition, right? I'm a big fan of getting the coalition of willing to just go and do the thing. So, but to yours and Mike's point, this is a different coalition. We're in a new era where it involves device makers, right? And AI developers, and right, you name it, automated vehicle, right, manufacturers. Everybody's in this together. And so you have to just think a little bit differently. It's not your ordinary group of OEMs. And then finally, I'm just going to punctuate the thing that you're known for, Jane, the data, right? Like, we need to get a handle on this. It's available, right? I envy the developer who can train, right, a model of, an AI model on what's available. And, whenever I had a chance to talk to those types of companies and people, I would say, well, here's a problem to solve for, and here's all the data. I think it's available, and I think it's there, and we're going to get incredible insights if we pursue this pathway.
Thank you, Vin. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to the participants in the audience and especially to our really active participants, Ellen, Cormac, Sean, and John Pedrick. Great questions. We didn't get to all of them. And I know that, Mike, you have plans for further podcasts, further discussions. Thank you for including me in this one. I look forward to seeing you again.
Jade, thanks for your moderation. You did great.
Thank you.